What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Fantasy Football 201. In today's video, we're going to look at players that are under 40% rostered that you should both stash and start for week 12 at each of the positions. Then we will take a look at defenses that are under 50% rostered that you want to pick up because they will be extremely beneficial for you in the playoffs and may help you win a championship. If you're interested in more content like this, please subscribe to my channel, like this video, and drop a comment. I reply to all my commenters, and if you comment, you'll have your questions answered on the show as well. So please take advantage of that and ask any questions you can, and the goal of this channel is to help you win a fantasy football championship. All right, so we will be looking at the players that are under 40% rostered first. We will go through each of the positions just like we've done every week this season. We'll go through quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight end, and an additional flex that I would consider starting for this week, as well as stashes. So we will start with our quarterback stashes. And the stash of the week for week 12 for me is Tommy DeVito. Tommy DeVito has just been promoted to the starting quarterback for the New York Giants. A lot of people thought it would be Drew Lock, but it was actually Tommy DeVito because New York is pretty much throwing their hat into the ring of trying to get a rookie quarterback, hopefully get Shedeur Sanders for their case, but they're going to be rolling with Tommy DeVito. But I actually really like him as a very sneaky fantasy option rest of season. So Tommy DeVito, if you're in two quarterback leagues, I think he gives you a decent floor that you would be comfortable enough to put in your lineup. He's not a great quarterback option for me this week. He's somewhere around the 17 to 23 range, I would say, among starting quarterbacks, but he has been very effective in fantasy last season, and he gives you a lot of mobility that makes him very attractive. Last season, you look at some of his numbers. In week 11 against Washington, he was the quarterback 7 on the week. He had 22 fantasy points that week. And then in week 14, he rushed the ball 10 times for 71 yards. That was that notorious Packers game where he won on Monday Night Football, and that was kind of the culmination of the Tommy DeVito craze that was going on back then, Tommy Cutlets, as he's well known. And he also was 17 of 21 passing in that game too. So he has proven to be an effective enough quarterback that he could be relevant in fantasy. And for this particular week, he gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which are ranked 30th against quarterbacks. So Tampa Bay, this is a very intriguing matchup that he could actually do very well this week, especially if he could also utilize his rushing ability too. I'm not a big proponent of putting Tommy DeVito in my lineup, though, unless you're in a two quarterback league that's deep enough that you could start him. But I think he will give you a decent enough floor around, I would say 12 to 15 points that I think you could be, if you're in a pinch with the bye weeks this week, Tommy DeVito could be a solid super flex option for you. So in one quarterback leagues, a quarterback that I would consider to start this week who's under 40% rostered is Drake Maye. Drake Maye is only 20.8% rostered, and he gets Miami this weekend. But what I really like about Drake Maye is that he has played pretty well this season, and it's been underrated in terms of how he's performed as a fantasy quarterback. So Drake Maye, since he's taken over the starting role, he has not had any games that have been bad enough to really sink you. He's the lowest floor performance that he's had has been 11.5 points, which he had in week 8. But the rest of his weeks this season, he has 19, 20, 11, 15, 11, and just under 18 fantasy points this season in each of the 6 games that he started. For context, he has 3 games out of those 6 over the past 6 weeks that have been over 17.9 points, and Patrick Mahomes only has 2 games in which he scored over 17.9 points. So you can make the argument that starting Drake Maye is the equivalent of starting Patrick Mahomes right now in terms of numbers production. They get Miami this week, which is a tough matchup by the numbers on quarterbacks, but Miami has, as I've already talked about before, quarterback teams, when Miami was struggling and they didn't have Tua, teams did not need to throw on them because they were so effective just running the ball because they knew they didn't have the quarterback play that could keep up with their offenses. Now that we have uh, Tua back, the defense has to hold its own more against offenses that need to keep up with that Miami offense. So Gardner Minshew last week was respectable enough in fantasy where he had just under 18 points as well. So I'm suspecting that Drake Maye again this week will get around the 18 to 20 point range at quarterback, which should be enough to fall within the top 12 of quarterbacks for this week. And that said, I think that Drake Maye is an excellent start. He's only 20.8% rostered and would be a great pickup for this week. And I usually only mention one honorable mention, but these are more deep league considerations that I think could really be sneaky options as the season goes along. I'll start with Will Levis, and I won't spend a lot of time on him because I've talked about his schedule extensively for the fantasy playoffs, but he has an excellent schedule that includes Jacksonville twice between weeks 14 to 17, also includes Cincinnati and Indianapolis. So that's about as good as it gets. He's only 3.9% rostered. Brandon Allen is the backup quarterback to Brock Purdy, who will not be playing this week. And I think Brandon Allen, I'm suspecting this will only be a spot start, and I would not play him against Green Bay, but I do think that this is another very intriguing option in deep two quarterback leagues that Brandon Allen could be effective. I don't like him as much as I would like Drake Maye or even Tommy DeVito, but I think that Brandon Allen could give you a solid floor as well, that if you're really in a pinch, you're trying to decide between that super flex option of a fringe running back or a guy like Brandon Allen, I would go with Brandon Allen. And then Daniel Jones, he's only 1.2% roster, by the way. But then Daniel Jones dropped by the Giants, who Tommy DeVito is replacing, now a free agent. So Daniel Jones, the things to consider here is that there's a possibility that he could be signed by one of these teams that's really struggling at quarterback right now, namely Las Vegas, Tennessee are two teams that come to mind. Or there's also a possibility he either goes unsigned or he signs with a contending team as a backup. But in very deep leagues, consider the possibility of checking if Daniel Jones is out there, because depending on where he signs, it could lead to an opportunity for him to start again later this season. All right, running backs under 40% rostered, and there's some good ones for this week. So first, the stash of the week that I'm looking at is Cam Akers, who's 21.9% rostered. He gets Chicago this week, which is the 20th matchup against running backs. And Cam Akers, the backup to Aaron Jones, recently traded to Minnesota, so he's kind of come a little bit more onto the scene to regain to take over the second running back job. But Aaron Jones is struggling, and Cam Akers has seen an increase in his volume over the past 3 weeks that is a little concerning of the possibility for the Aaron Jones managers that Akers could be taking over this backfield. So this is a sneaky handcuff that could actually be gaining more steam as the season goes along and could be a great play that could really help you rest of season. Over the last 3 weeks, he had 6, 13, and 10 carries. He got some goal line work last week and caught a receiving touchdown. And as I said, if Aaron Jones continues to struggle, they may ride the hot hand with Cam Akers, who Kevin O'Connell has an affinity for him because they've already traded for him twice within the span of him being released into other teams over the past 3 seasons. So Cam Akers is a very intriguing candidate to take over this Minnesota backfield and really be a sleeper the rest of the way. He should be stashed. He's only 21.9% rostered. My start for this week is Ameer Abdullah. And if you've been following the news about the Raiders backfield, Alexander Mattison has an ankle injury, and Zamir White, I believe, has a concussion. And they are both doubtful for the game this weekend. So Ameer Abdullah is going to get get Denver this week, which is a tough matchup for running backs. But the thing I like about Abdullah that I think will make him effective, especially in PPR, is a spot start, especially for those managers that have Chase Brown, Breece Hall, James Cook, etc., that have buys this week. Ameer Abdullah is a great pass-catching running back. He caught a passing touchdown last week. And I think in this particular game where I'm suspecting Denver will be blowing out Las Vegas, I'm expecting a lot of targets to go Ameer Abdullah's way, and that he will be an effective enough running back start that should give you at least 10 fantasy points this week, that I would definitely be picking him up and playing him. He's only 12.4% rostered, and that number is it has increased drastically over the last few days. He was only like 1% rostered a few days ago. So he is probably still out there in a lot of leagues, check to see if he is, and I think he could be the running back replacement that you need for this week. And then an honorable mention, kind of in the same line of Cam Akers and Ameer Abdullah, Roschon Johnson. And I think that he would be a great start if DeAndre Swift does not play. He does get Minnesota, though, which is a tough matchup. So that's why I don't really like him as much as Abdullah if DeAndre Swift does not play. But just keep in mind, Roschon Johnson has also been getting increased volume over the last couple weeks. And with the Bears changing offensive coordinators to Thomas Brown, it's possible that they may be trying to see what they have with Roschon Johnson. He got a rushing touchdown last week. He also got 10 carries last week, too, out of the 24 running back carries. So this is something to really monitor moving forward as the season progresses. He's only 17.4% rostered as lightly rostered as well. And especially for Dynasty, this is a really important add to me because not a lot of people are talking about Roschon Johnson, but there's a real world next season, especially with the Khalil Herbert trade where he was cleared out, that Roschon Johnson could be the lead running back for the Bears next season. So check if he's out there. I think he could be a okay play for this week, but more so the long-term value to me is very high with him. Wide receivers. So my wide receiver stash for week 12 is Marquez Valdez-Scantling. He's only 15.6% rostered, and he's on a bye this week. But I would stash him if he is out there because he is the number one wide receiver on New Orleans. And I've talked about the limitations with him and the lack of volume that is concerning for me with fantasy wide receivers, and especially Marquez Valdez-Scantling in particular throughout his career. But there's no denying that he is the number one wide receiver for the Saints. They really need somebody to step up with the injuries that they've had. No telling when Olave will come back. And they have a nice schedule after the bye week for receivers. They get Los Angeles, the Rams, next week, which is a poor pass defense. Then they get the New York Giants and then the Washington Commanders. So that's a pretty nice schedule. But then in the championship game, they get Las Vegas in week 17. So although historically I do not like Marquez Valdez-Scantling as a fantasy receiver, there's a great opportunity ahead of him that he could really be a very sneaky play for you that you could put into that wide receiver 3 or flex role and could lead you to a championship. And then my start for this week that is under 40% roster, this is a player I've talked about quite a bit on this channel, Xavier Legette. He has fallen to 36.6% rostered. So because of that, I was happy to include him on this segment today of the under 40% roster because I think he's a real sleeper rest of season. Number one wide receiver on the Panthers, has shown a lot of promise this season. But they do get Kansas City, which is a tough matchup. So you may be dissuaded, and because of that, he's been dropped in a lot of places. But to me, I think that the formula suggests that Xavier Legette will be involved in this game. Carolina is going to be behind. They're going to be trailing to Kansas City and needing to throw a lot. And Legette is the type of player that I think that they will get involved frequently. Kansas City, the receivers that tend to do well against them are the possession type receivers, not necessarily the guys that really break the big plays. But you saw this past week, Khalil Shakir, very effective. And Xavier Legette has been somebody that they've kind of moved around a little bit. I think that he could be somebody that, especially after this bye week and additional preparation, they try to get him more involved. So he's not an amazing start for this week compared to a lot of the guys that are already heavily rostered. But I think that Legette could be a great play that is being slept on as somebody that could be a real sleeper rest of season. And the thing I like about Legette is that he has a very great schedule the rest of the way as well. So not only are you getting a potential bargain for this week, but then some great value as the season progresses with Legette. So we'll pull up his schedule in just a sec. But he has a top 10 schedule the rest of the way for wide receivers. So a very attractive slate for the rookie out of South Carolina. Xavier Legette over the next few weeks, he gets Tampa Bay in week 13, which is a very poor pass defense. Philadelphia is a little more challenging, but then they get Dallas in week 15, which we've seen them struggle quite a bit on defense this season. Arizona, tough matchup in week 16, but then in the championship, Tampa Bay again. So this team gets to the opportunity to take advantage of Tampa Bay's defense twice, and I think that Xavier Legette could be a real sleeper the rest of the way. that should be far more than 36.6% rostered. I would get him this week, and I'd be happy to play him if you are in a pinch. DeVaughn Vele is my honorable mention wide receiver. He's only 1.4% rostered. So, and I think that he is a solid option to put in and play as well, given the circumstances. Vele has, there's been a lot of news about Bo Nix and how he has played so well over the last few weeks. But for DeVaughn Vele, he is emerging as the wide receiver 2 behind Courtland Sutton and has been getting quite a bit of targets the last few weeks. Vele is a rookie this season, and over the last few weeks, he had 4 targets and a touchdown against Kansas City. Another reason why I like Legette to still be a interesting option against Kansas City is because some of these lesser roster receivers have scored well against them that are possession receivers like Legette. And then Atlanta, he was 4 for 66 off 5 targets. So in both of the last 2 games, he's had over 10 PPR points in fantasy. And I think that in this particular matchup against Vegas, I see Bo Nix being able to stretch the field and get the passing game involved. And I think Vele will be right around the same as he's been the last 2 weeks, getting about 10 points. Sorry about that. Some dogs are barking. We will move to the tight ends. And sticking with my theme of Carolina, this is another guy I've talked about a lot because of the opportunity that's in front of him. JaTavion Sanders. He's only 1% rostered right now. And I think there's a real opportunity where he could be a great play this week. I just don't like him because there hasn't been a lot that we've seen tangibly from him that suggests that we could put him in right away. But Kansas City this week has struggled against tight ends. They're the 29th against the tight end. Sanders has an argument to be the number 2 wide receiver, especially if Thielen does not play, the number 2 pass catching option, especially if Adam Thielen does not play this week. He's been getting some increased targets over the last few weeks. He also caught a touchdown right before their bye in week 10. And again, the schedule, as I've already talked about with Legette, very attractive for Sanders as well, getting Tampa Bay twice and then Dallas again. So this is more of a play that I want to make sure that I have him on my roster to stash in, because I do think that Sanders could be a sleeper rest of the way, that, as I talked about in an earlier video, could finish as a top 20 tight end at the end of the season based on the schedule that they have the rest of the way. But I would not play him for week 12. The tight end that I would play, though, under 40% rostered at 34.2, he's almost out of this range of under 40, Will Dissly. And Will Dissly, another guy that I've talked about, that he's getting a lot of opportunity lately, has been an effective stream, and he has a top 10 schedule rest of the way. In fact, I believe he has the number 1 schedule the rest of the way for tight ends. Will Dissly gets Baltimore this week, but then he has some great matchups coming up over the next couple weeks, to include Atlanta, Kansas City, Tampa Bay, and then New England in week 17. So Will Dissly, a great play to finish out some of these bye week streams. He got 4 receptions, 80 yards, and a touchdown last week against the Bengals. He's gotten at least 6 targets in 4 of the last 5 weeks. So we've seen him be very involved in the Chargers offense. So I would continue to roll with Dissly. I think he's a great play for this week against Baltimore. I would be starting Will Dissly, like him as a top 10 tight end this week. And another great option that you can pivot to, don't like him as much as Will Dissly, but an honorable mention, Luke Schoonmaker. So Jake Ferguson is out, and Cooper Rush has relied heavily on the tight end position in Dallas because he's a little more limited than Dak Prescott, and just in general, Dallas's wide receivers are pretty limited outside of CeeDee Lamb. So Luke Schoonmaker, last week against Houston, 6 receptions, 56 yards, no touchdowns, but he got 10 targets. So that's the type of thing you love with tight ends, is that it's consistent involvement like that. And they get Washington this week, which is an improving defense. But again, another situation where I think Dallas will be down in this game, and they're going to rely upon their tight end position for short yardage situations. I think Schoonmaker will be a solid stream option for this week. I like him as a top 15 tight end for this week. And I think he's potentially startable depending on the other options that you have. All right, and then in the flex, get a little bit of variety this week. We're going to go with the running back as my stash, and it is Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals. Trey Benson has emerged as the second running back on this team and has been a solid, had some solid numbers the last 2 games. He had 8 carries and 10 carries as well as touchdowns in those games. Trey Benson has the advantage of a nice schedule the rest of the way. It's number 6 for running backs. And but the thing that's important, and I've already kind of talked about this a little bit with Dobbins and the Chargers, is that James Conner does have his health concerns of his own. He's been healthy this season, but if anything were to happen to James Conner, Trey Benson is somebody that must be rostered because with his strength of schedule, he could be a real lottery ticket for you that can help you win a championship at the end of the season. Only 27.5% rostered. So of the handcuffs, he is another great option. And again, as I've already talked about with Roschon Johnson, great dynasty upside. Conner is starting to age. This is an interesting option that is offense that is has a lot of young players like Marvin Harrison, McBride, Kyler Murray. And Benson, there's a real world where he could be the starting running back for them and could be the caliber of a top 10 running back within the next 2 seasons, depending on how things break for him. You know, that sounds pretty crazy right now, but very talented rookie running back, and I think there's a world where he continues to get more involved, especially should anything happen to James Conner. And then my start among the flex position, and this is a very available player, is only 6.8% rostered, Nick-Westbrook-lkhine. And this is a player that, again, much like Marquez Valdez-Scantling, I generally avoid his archetype in that he doesn't get a lot of targets. And if he does make big plays, it is a long bomb touchdown. And yes, he had a 99-yard touchdown last week, so we take that into context. But the other thing that's important to understand with Westbrook-lkhine is that he's actually getting very involved in the offense now. And what I really like about him is that he has 6 targets. Two out of the last 3 weeks, he's had 6 targets, which is a lot more than some of these other receivers that are heavily rostered right now. And he has a touchdown in 5 out of the last 6 games. So it is a huge risk, and I do suspect that he's not going to be able to maintain this pace all season. But in a situation where Tennessee is, they need a second wide receiver. Calvin Ridley is their 1, but then they really need Westbrook-lkhine to step up as their 2. This is a solid option for you to play for this week. I think that Westbrook-lkhine will be among the options that you have available. He's one of the better ones that are lightly rostered. And I think in this game against Houston, which is 24th against the pass, we could see some Westbrook-lkhine involvement that if you're just looking for a floor play, somebody to get you around 8 to 12 points, I think Westbrook-lkhine could do that. And the last point that I want to make is that his numbers have backed this up as well. He has not scored under 6 PPR fantasy points since playing this season in week 6. Every game since then, he has had at least 6 fantasy points, and he's had 3 games in which he's exceeded double digits. Most specifically this past week where he was 19.7 fantasy points. It's a huge risk, but I think I would be comfortable to stay in the flames in a pinch and go with Westbrook-lkhine in a solid matchup against Houston this week. And then my honorable mentions, I'm going to go with 2 players on the same team. One I've talked about frequently, Demario Douglas, 28.7% rostered, and then Kayshon Boutte, who is 5.1% rostered. So I bring them up because New England is a offense that doesn't have a lot of talent, but Drake Maye is improving and he's getting better. And as I already talked about him earlier as his start for this week, they need a number 1 receiver, and it's looking like it's going to be either Boutte or Douglas are the ones that take it. I've been very bullish on Demario Douglas, but Kayshon Boutte as well has 6 targets in the last 4 games, so he could be somebody that could sneak in there as well. I don't like either of these 2 as people that you would want to start for this week. unless you're in very deep leagues. But I think that they're both intriguing names to keep an eye on that could be very effective as the season progresses. All right, so we will talk about defenses that are under 50% rostered. And I'm going to go through the defenses that I really like that you could probably still pick up and could be great options for you as your starting defense in the fantasy football playoffs. So, most of the show I talk about the key positions like the flex positions and the quarterback, but the defenses are often the old saying defense wins championships is true for football, but it's actually true for fantasy football sometimes too. And there's some great options out there that could be real sleepers to keep an eye on. So the first thing I'm going to give my superlatives. Imagine this is like I don't know, like a high school yearbook thing or whatever. I don't really know how to put it better than that. But who would be my end of the season MVP at the defense? And these are, the lightly rostered defenses that could help carry you through week 12 to 14 that a lot of people may not be keeping an eye on. And my answer is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Tampa Bay is 60% rostered, so they're kind of just outside of this range. Check if they are available. It's a risk because they have not been a great defense this season, but they have some really juicy matchups and could be a solid option for you given the quarterbacks that they're facing. So week 12, they're playing Tommy DeVito, which, I talked about Tommy DeVito's upside, but, there's a downside to that as well. And the next week, they get Bryce Young, another notorious quarterback who's struggled. Then they get Las Vegas, which right now it's Gardner Minshew. Who knows who's going to be in 2 weeks because they seem to be playing roulette every other week with the quarterback position. Then tough matchup week 15 against the Chargers, but then their final 2 games in the fantasy playoffs, Dallas in week 16, which, by that point it may be Trey Lance playing, which is a turnover machine if you've never watched him play before. And then they get Bryce Young again. So as a defense, this is a very intriguing option, but I really like this stretch from week 12 to 14 where they're playing all backup quarterbacks, and especially backup quarterbacks that have turnover issues. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops, but I think Tampa Bay could be the real sleeper that I would keep an eye on that could really help you in this closing stretch of the season. Who are the best bye week replacement defense? And to me, it is the Arizona Cardinals. So Arizona, much improved over the last few weeks. Their defense is playing a lot better, and I believe 2 out of the past 3 weeks, their defense has scored at least 10 fantasy points. So this defense getting better. They made a trade to add Browning at the deadline to improve their linebacker position. But then they get Seattle in both week 12 this week and week 14. Seattle, they're a solid offense, but Geno Smith very turnover prone. And because of that, Arizona, whose defense, as I've already mentioned, is playing pretty well, if they get the opportunity for some pick sixes, it could make them a very attractive option for you. And yeah, just to go back and refresh the numbers. So Arizona against the Chargers, which is a good offense, 7 points. And then over the last 2 weeks, 13 and 11 fantasy points against the Bears and the Jets. So, and then the other thing that I like about Arizona is that in week 16, they get Carolina, another great gold mine for point opportunity, and New England in week 15. So this is a sneaky defense to keep an eye on, and I think they're a great bye week replacement. Who is your sneaky playoff defense? The defense that's available right now, they've got some tough matchups to close the season, but could be a sneaky play in the playoffs. And my answer is going to be the Atlanta Falcons. So Atlanta, the thing that's nice about Atlanta is, they've got obviously, they've got the bye this week, and then they've got some tough matchups coming up. But in week 15, they get Las Vegas, and then in week 16, they get the New York Giants. They play Washington in week 17, so it doesn't really apply to the championship week. But they could be a real sneaky play in the early rounds of the playoffs that could be very effective for you. And I like them as, especially the early playoffs, a good sneaky team. All right, the gambling man play. All right, so this is the defense that you would be taking a huge gamble on, but you're getting really juicy matchups that could really be beneficial. And it is the Cincinnati Bengals. Yes, Cincinnati's defense has been terrible this season, but if you look at the matchups between week 14 to 16, Dallas really struggling right now. Look, they just gave up number one scoring defense performance versus Houston this past week. Then they get Tennessee, Will Levis. Then they get week 16, Jameis Winston. So you'd be taking a huge risk because Cincinnati has been a terrible defense this season. I believe they're the 28th ranked fantasy scoring defense on the season. But there's a real argument to be made in this stretch from week 14 to 16 that they could provide some really solid value for you. And if you miss out on some of these other defenses that I talk about, like Tampa Bay or Atlanta, you'd be taking a huge risk with Cincinnati, but it could really actually be very effective for you in the early rounds of the playoffs. And then who is my championship defense that is under 50% rostered? And that is because they're on a bye this week, and it is the Buffalo Bills. Buffalo doesn't have the best of matchups over the next few weeks, but in weeks 16 and 17, this is especially important for those teams that are going to get the first round bye to make sure that you get Buffalo if they're out there. They get New England in week 16, and then they get the Jets in week 17. So that's about as good as you can get. Who knows if Aaron Rodgers will be starting by that point in the season? They may turn it over to Tyrod Taylor or maybe even Daniel Jones for all we know. Who knows how that's going to develop? So I think that Buffalo, if they're out there and you have a good shot of getting the first round bye or have a spot for them, you feel confident that you can get to the championship round, I'd be all over picking up Buffalo. That is my championship defense that you want to pick up for the playoffs. So, and then real quick, we'll just go through the week by week. And first of all, check to see if these defenses are out there. Tampa Bay, who I've talked about, Arizona, who I've also talked about, and then Washington. So Washington doesn't have the best schedule necessarily in the playoffs, but for the next 2 weeks, they have Dallas and then Tennessee. 68% available, so probably roster. But Washington, especially in that week 13 matchup against Tennessee, should be one of the best defenses available. Other good options for week 13 that you could look at specifically, the Giants and the Cowboys are playing each other on Thanksgiving Day. Could be a lot of opportunities for pick sixes. So we'll see how that one goes. It's interesting, they picked that game thinking it'd be Daniel Jones and Dak Prescott, and now they're getting Cooper Rush and Tommy DeVito in that game. But yeah. Jets are playing Seattle, which is an opportunity for both of them to do well against each other. And then the Colts are playing the Patriots in that week. And the Colts have not been a great defense, so I don't really like them too much. But week 13, not really the best for streams, but there are some intriguing options. Week 14, though, there's some good streaming options. And that's important because there's a lot of bye weeks. So now is the time to start looking ahead at this stuff, because if you have an extra bench spot, make sure you grab these defenses a week before, at least. So for week 14, check if Philadelphia is available. They're playing Carolina. That's one of the best plays that you can have for week 14, in my opinion. New Orleans is playing the Giants. New Orleans has been an iffy defense, but could be a good matchup there. Tennessee is playing Jacksonville. And I think, the Jacksonville situation, especially the teams that are playing them, are going to be extremely important to monitor, because if Trevor Lawrence has not come back, I think Mac Jones is going to deliver a top 5 fantasy performance for whatever defense is going up against him, because he's just that bad. And Tennessee has the good fortunes of playing him in week 14 and then again in week 17. So pay attention to that. Tennessee could be very interesting as a defensive stream as well. I would not go as far to say that you could play Jacksonville against Tennessee, though, because Jacksonville's defense is horrendous. And then this is when we start to get into that picture of the Bengals where they're getting the Cowboys that week. And they're a real bold decision. I don't know if I would do that personally, but there's a real argument to be made that Cincinnati could actually have some good defensive performances for between that week 14 to 16 stretch. Then in week 15, there's some good options as well. This is the first week of the playoffs for most people. Arizona against New England. I've already mentioned Arizona, much improving defense and a real sleeper to watch out for. Baltimore against the Giants. And Baltimore struggled, but we'll see how this experiment goes with Devito as the quarterback. Atlanta, as I already talked about, this is when they start to become attractive and they get Las Vegas in week 15. The Jets get Jacksonville, which Jets have struggled on defense, but let's see if Mac Jones or Trevor Lawrence is the quarterback, because the Jets have been effective when they've gone up against poor quarterback play this season in fantasy defense. Cincinnati gets Tennessee, and then Dallas gets Carolina. So there's a lot of interesting options in week 15 that I think are going to be important to see how this develops over the next few weeks. But really pay attention to these teams that I talked about, because there's a lot of great streaming options for that first week of the fantasy football playoffs. Week 16 is very intriguing as well. You have the Indianapolis Colts playing Tennessee, as I've talked about. Atlanta plays the Giants. And then Buffalo, I've started to mention Buffalo, they get New England. So as I've already mentioned, Buffalo, probably the best play that you can have. Cincinnati against Cleveland. Jacksonville and Las Vegas are playing each other. So there's an argument to be made that those could be intriguing defenses. Although I would personally almost never play the Raiders. Even if Mac Jones was the quarterback, I don't know if I would go so far as to play Las Vegas, but we'll see, because he's looked rough. I couldn't imagine him being any worse than he was with New England last year, but he's definitely living up to it. Tampa Bay back on the pine again. They get Dallas that week. Could be a good matchup for that defense. And then week 17, some great matchups here. And another honorable, I've mentioned Buffalo against the Jets. That's the number one pick you can get. But if you're playing for that one fantasy game that could be a real championship boost, Los Angeles Chargers get New England that week. So that's another great one. Los Angeles has been dropped in a lot of places because they didn't do well against the Bengals last week, and then they get Baltimore this week. But they have a great week 17 matchup, so keep an eye out for that. Tampa Bay gets Carolina, New Orleans gets Las Vegas, and then the Colts get the New York Giants. So you see some familiar names in here that I've talked about quite a bit, and a lot of these teams, as I mentioned, are under 50% available. So take a look to see if those teams are out there. They could be great options for you in the fantasy football playoffs. And at this time of year, I start to roster a defense ahead. So I have my defense I'm playing for this week, but then I'm looking at my week 13 defense. And I would do that the rest of the way to make sure that you're set up in a position for success in the fantasy football playoffs. And then finally, we'll close things out and we'll talk about weather. So an important thing to bring up that is kind of an afterthought a lot of times in fantasy, and I think it was really illustrated by that Thursday night game, is that when you have inclement weather in those games like Cleveland, Buffalo, Green Bay, it really limits a lot of the offensive upside and changes how players are involved. So we saw a lot of Jalen Warren, especially, Nick Chubb was very effective in this game because they needed to run the ball when you're playing in a blizzard versus throwing it, which is why guys like, Njoku, George Pickens, etc. all really struggled in this game. So I bring this up because this is something to pay attention to as the season goes along. And as we go through these start-sit videos, I'm going to start giving weather alerts of how I think these games could be affected. So this is the first one that we'll do to kind of close out the video today. The weather alert that I have for this week, there's not a lot, but the thing to keep an eye on right now is that Tampa Bay and the Giants, there's 15-mile-an-hour winds for that game. 50 degrees, so it's not super cold, but MetLife Stadium is notorious for having tons of wind, and it really can throw off both the kicking game and the passing game. So all that being said, I think this is more concern. 15 mile an hour isn't anything too crazy, but just keep an eye on if that develops and it gets into the 20s. I think that really becomes alarming for some of the pass catching options. So I think the Giants, it's more, you're still going to be playing like Malik Neighbors. That's not anything of concern to me, but the other fringe guys like Wan'Dale Robinson, guys, Slayton, guys like that may struggle more. But it could be better outcomes for guys like Tyrone Tracy or even Tommy DeVito. They may need to rely on him running the ball more, and he's a mobile quarterback. So I would be monitoring that situation as the weather develops in this game. And then Tampa Bay, Mike Evans coming back. I'd be playing him, but I would be more cautious if there's going to be a lot of wind of what his involvement will be. I think anything that would probably help out the running backs more. I would probably give them more targets, both Bucky Irving and Rachaad White. Other than that, there's not a lot of big weather concerns for this week, but there's going to be some as the season goes along. So I'll be including this weather segment to give you forewarning of that. All right, well, that's all that I've got for this video. If you have any questions last minute before the games start tomorrow, please comment in this video below. Ask any questions you have, and I'll be happy to help you win this week and set you up for success to win your fantasy football championships. So please subscribe to the channel, and hope you guys have a great week 12. We'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.